Train Signal. You're watching a video about network security. In this video, we're going to start off by talking about all the different types of firewalls that you can use to help protect your network. Then we'll take a look at some of the other security devices and other security means that we can use to help keep our network secure. After that, we'll look at security from a network access point of view, including filtering, tunneling, and encryption, and we'll look at some of the different remote access protocols. Then we'll take a look at all the different forms of user authentication that are available. We'll see how to make our devices more secure. We'll go over some of the common security threats that are out there and how we can help mitigate against those threats. But before we get started, I want to tell you that having an understanding about security is a crucial component to being a successful network administrator. But at the same time, I will also tell you that at the end of this video, you are not necessarily going to be ready to go out and be a full-blown security engineer. There is much more to know about security than what I can share with you here in one video. As a matter of fact, there are entire courses on nothing but security. If you're looking into the CompTIA Network Plus certification, well, CompTIA also has a Security Plus certification, which again covers all this material in much greater detail. And the last thing that I want to tell you, and then we're going to get into this, when it comes to security, well, there really is no end to the knowledge that you can have. Just when you think you might know everything there is to know about securing a network, well, something changes. There's some new form of attack. Somebody has gotten creative and figured out a new way to harm people's networks. So keep in mind that network security, very important. It's a never-ending process of trying to keep up with how to keep your network secure. And in this video, everything that we're going to talk about is going to be pretty much on kind of a high-level overview of the basics that you would need to know to be a successful network administrator. Alright, so starting off here, let's talk a little bit about firewalls. Well, firewalls is something that we've talked about a couple other times in this course. And as we know, firewalls are used to control the flow of data, or to be more specific, to control the flow of data in or out of a network. Now, there are many different ways that firewalls can control this data, or can control what data gets in and out. And the first thing I will tell you is that, well, they can either be network-based or host-based. And what I mean by that is a firewall can be put in place to help protect a specific computer. For instance, all of today's Windows operating systems come with something called Windows Firewall. And that is something that is designed to protect that individual system and will help control what data can travel in and out of that specific computer. Or they could be network-based, which is the way we typically think of firewalls, where we actually help protect the entire network. We put it out at the perimeter, at the edges of our network. We put it at the point where we have connectivity to the outside world, so as to help protect the internal network. Now, I will also tell you that different firewalls have functionality at different layers of the OSI model. And if you remember from earlier in this course, the OSI model has 7 layers. And as you go up through the layers, you kind of go up in functionality. So I can tell you that firewalls can perform functionality at many different layers of the OSI model, but typically you will find that your standard, not too sophisticated firewalls will have functionality at the network layer, where you're just doing raw packet filtering, where you're just basically looking at IP addresses and basing what gets in and what does not get in, and what goes out and what does not get out based upon those IP addresses, and possibly also the port, the specific port that they're attempting to communicate through. Now, sometimes these types of firewalls are what's referred to as stateless firewalls. And I mention that because, as you can see here, certain application layer firewalls, so firewalls that function at a high layer in the OSI model, can do, first of all, we have here something called stateful inspection. With stateful inspection, well, because we're functioning at a higher layer in the OSI model, well, these firewalls have the ability to go ahead and not just look at the IP address and look at the destination and the source and look at the specifics of the header, but it can go right into the actual packet. It can examine the packet. It can also examine what's called the packet stream, meaning we can look at the full stream of packets to see if they are trying to manipulate their way, or sometimes I say almost zigzag their way through the firewall by going in one port and coming out another, or having different requests for the same services coming in on different ports and things like that. Now, another type of added functionality that we have with our application layer firewalls is something here called scanning services, or what is most typically referred to as like virus scanning services or malware scanning services, where basically you have a firewall that has the ability to scan the content of the packet to see if it has any malicious code. Now, along those same lines, we also have content filtering, whereas it's not so much scanning for generalized malicious or what could be malicious code, but it's looking for very specific types of code. In other words, you can configure the firewall to say, look, here are specific signatures that you will find, which, by the way, that leads us right down to signature identification, where you know that there's some specific makeup of content, or in the case of signature identification, a very specific program that you know is going to be harmful to your network. Now, the kind of overall point here with our application layer firewalls is make sure you understand that that means, because it's a higher layer in the OSI model, that means that those firewalls can actually go into the data. It can get deeper into the packet itself so as to help look at what it is being brought into a network so as to help protect that network. Now, another thing that you can do with firewalls, and as opposed to just putting up this one wall of protection between the inside and outside of your network, is that you can use multiple firewalls to create what's called perimeter networks, or what's more commonly referred to as a DMZ, or a demilitarized zone. Now, here I have a picture of what this DMZ would look like. As you can see, out here we have our internet cloud, right? We have the dangerous outside World Wide Web. We have a firewall that any user from the internet would have to go through in order to get into this DMZ and access this server that we have here. But yet there would be another firewall that they would have to go through in order to get into our internal network, where we might have maybe servers of a more secure nature. So as for instance, this server in the DMZ might be our company's web server, a server that we do want to allow access to the outside world, while at the same time want to make sure that, well, first of all, we want it protected, right? We don't want our web server just completely wide open, so we do have the one firewall to help protect it. But because we're going to open up that first firewall to allowing some traffic to get through to get to this web server, well, we implement this second firewall to go ahead and help protect our internal network with the more secure servers. Now, besides firewalls, some of our other security devices are our IDSs and IPSs, which we've talked about previously, whereas an IDS, an intrusion detection system, is used to help an administrator recognize a possible attack that could be taking place on a network or a system, whereas an intrusion prevention system is very similar to the IDS, except for that it will actively make changes to help lock down the network or system if this potential intrusion is present. So, and here's the thing, I will tell you that very often the IDS, the intrusion detection system, is considered to be a passive system in the sense that it only watches for possible attacks, whereas an IPS, an intrusion prevention system, is considered to be active, or I've even seen it listed as reactive, because what it'll do is it'll react when it sees a potential problem. It'll actually go in and lock things down. So make sure you understand the difference between those two, even though they are very, very similar. One just watches passively, and the other one actively will make changes to the network without having to contact the administrator first. And along those same lines, you want to make sure that your IPSs are watched very closely, because if a false positive were to come in, things are going to start being locked down and users may be inconvenienced when there's not really any intrusion or attack taking place on your network. Now, one other security device that I want to mention is this thing called a VPN concentrator. Now, we talked about VPNs earlier in this course, and we learned that a VPN is something that is used, a virtual private network, is used to allow remote users who are away from the office, to be able to securely become part of the local network. Well, a VPN concentrator is basically a piece of hardware that is used pretty much as your VPN server. Now, I will say it's not literally always the VPN server, because there are VPN concentrators which will perform some of the functionality, like actually authenticating who's coming in and setting up the encryption between the remote user and the internal network, but then it'll pass it on to a software-based VPN server, which will truly give access to the network. Or in some cases, this concentrator is the full-blown VPN server. Now, we're going to talk more about VPN here in just a moment. But understand that a VPN concentrator is a piece of hardware. It's a hardware-based VPN solution. All right. Now let's move along to securing our network access, securing access to the network itself. The first level of protection we have when it comes to network access security is filtering. And filtering comes basically in two flavors. We can either filter based upon the MAC address, the physical hardware address, and typically, where do we see this? We learned about this earlier in the course. We see this with wireless access. Our wireless access points, one of the ways that we can help protect the wireless network is by setting up MAC filtering. The other form of filtering that we have is IP filtering. And IP filtering is typically used, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, by your network layer firewalls. And this is done to control who, or we could say what, in the case of what computers, can access your network. Or again, possibly a system if it's a host-based firewall. Now, in both cases, the way the process basically works is you have your lists. You have your lists, and those lists are actually referred to as access control lists. And these access control lists are compared against when someone or something wants to come in to the network. Now, I want to tell you that when it comes to MAC filtering and IP filtering, these access control lists can be done in one of two primary ways. One way to configure an access control list is to basically say everybody can come in except for specific MAC addresses or IP addresses that I say cannot. And these are very often referred to as a block list, where you're blocking specific individual MAC and IP addresses. The other way that you can set up the access control list is where you say nobody gets in, except for those that are specifically on the list and have been granted permission to come in. Okay, so this is very often referred to as an allow list. Kind of makes sense, right? A block list is, here's a list of systems that we're going to block, and an allow list is, well, here's a list of systems we're going to allow. I will tell you that it's more convenient to use a block list. Okay, it's more convenient to say, I'm just going to let everybody in and block out who I know to be bad. But although that may be a more convenient way to set up these lists, it's not the most secure way, because you're leaving huge openings as to who can come in. Whereas the allow list is not at all convenient, because you have to make sure that everybody that you want to allow in is on that list, and it's very easy to make a mistake and then have the inconvenience of having somebody call in and yell at you and say, why can't I get in? And then you have to go in and add them to the list, and it's kind of a hassle. But it's much more secure because you're being much more restrictive about who can come in. Now, when we want to talk about network access security, another aspect of protection is tunneling and encryption. Now, a few moments ago, we were talking about VPNs, virtual private networks. We said that they're used to securely extend the internal network out to remote clients. Well, how the heck is this done? Well, this is done through tunneling and encryption. This is done by creating what's called a secure tunnel through an unsecure network, like the internet. So if you have a remote user, somebody who, let's say, is at home but wants to connect to the corporate network, the internal company network, or maybe there's a user out on the road, out at a hotel somewhere. There's many different possibilities. Maybe they're at an airport. Well, they're going to come across the internet to access this network. Well, that's kind of a scary thought, isn't it? Because if they're going to go across the internet and they're going to be doing stuff on your internal network, whew, I don't know. That's, there's a lot of scary people out there on the internet. Well, the way you allow this to happen is by creating a tunnel where you tunnel through. You put if you picture driving through a tunnel, there's walls on every side of you, right? The ground is under you, and there's walls on the left, on the right, and up above you. It's secure. It's hard to get through the walls of a tunnel. Well, this tunnel is created through encryption. That's how it's done. There's no physical tunnel that's pushed through the internet. It's actually done through encryption. And this encryption is done through a variety of tunneling protocols. And I have them listed here. First, we have the point-to-point tunneling protocol, or what's known as PPTP. And I don't know about you, but I think PPTP is just fun to say. I know my daughter, who's a teenager now and doesn't find it funny anymore, but many years ago when she was just a little girl, when she would hear me teaching or talking to one of my students about PPTP, she would giggle. But all giggling aside, what is PPTP? Well, it's the point-to-point tunneling protocol. And this was one of the original tunneling encryption protocols. And I will tell you that it is supported by pretty much every platform out there. And quite honestly, is still, even today, considered to be a pretty secure, pretty reliable VPN tunneling protocol. And it's still used today by many systems that are out there, especially if you still have older, antiquated client operating systems, which, especially when it comes to your traveling users, your users who are away from the network, well, very often budgets tend to be low, and they'll be using an older laptop maybe and have an older operating system on them. So that's where you'd use PPTP. Now, if you have newer operating systems in place, then we can use the layer 2 tunneling protocol, or what's known as L2TP. L2TP has more advanced functionality, and I will tell you that most of the benefits of L2TP are kind of behind the scenes. So you won't necessarily see an obvious difference if you were to implement L2TP as opposed to PPTP. What I can tell you is that it uses a higher level of encryption. As a matter of fact, the type of encryption that the layer 2 tunneling protocol uses is IPsec, which we'll talk just a little bit more about IPsec in a moment. But as far as the other benefits of L2TP, we also have additional compression so that we have smaller packet sizes so that it can travel faster. And just there's a lot of behind the scenes flexibility. I'm not going to go into all the different details with you right now, but I will tell you that if you have newer systems, newer servers, newer clients, and they support L2TP, then I recommend that you do use it. Now, as far as IPsec goes, the reason I have it listed is, yes, IPsec is a protocol that was designed to provide just general secure communication, meaning it's an encryption protocol. But that encryption protocol can be set up to form a specific what's called IPsec tunnel, meaning in IPsec we have something called transport mode and tunneling mode. You would use transport mode of IPsec if you wanted systems to securely communicate within your network, whereas you would use tunneling mode in a scenario where maybe you have two different offices and you want to create a secure line of communication between the two offices over an unsecure network like the internet. So you can actually configure IPsec specifically in a tunneling mode to emulate what we all pretty much refer to as a VPN. Now, the one other side note that I want to tell you about IPsec that you're really going to want to know, and if you are planning on taking the Network Plus exam, this is something that you could be tested on, is that there are two primary protocols that actually make up IPsec. And the first is called AH, which stands for authentication headers. And the second is called ESP. No, it's not psychic, but ESP stands for the encapsulating security payload. And to give you the real simple breakdown, I don't want to get into a whole IPsec lesson here, but the real simple breakdown is that AH, authentication headers, are used for authentication of systems that are going to communicate securely using IPsec. So AH is used for authentication. I personally think it's easy to remember because AH has an A in it for authentication, and as a matter of fact, it actually stands for authentication headers. And then we have ESP, which is used for the actual encryption of the data, the securing of the data or securing of the payload. And again, easy to remember because ESP has an E for encryption. So just kind of a quick little side note there for you. Now, the one last thing that I'll tell you about VPNs is there is another way of creating a secure VPN, and it's through something called an SSL VPN. And an SSL VPN is it's a special type of VPN where the user will make connectivity through their web browser. Okay, so basically we're going to use HTTP. It's almost like creating a VPN over HTTPS would be the best way to explain what SSL VPNs are. Now, typically, this is not something that you will necessarily have to specifically set up unless you have a specialized web application that's going to make use of the SSL VPN functionality. So, if you understand what SSL is, Secure Sockets Layer, well, then it kind of makes sense that an SSL VPN is one that connects using a web browser, or HTTPS, which is HTTP using SSL. Now, I will also tell you that SSL VPNs can also use TLS, Transport Layer Security, which we learned in an earlier video is the more modern version of SSL. All right, the last component with regards to network access security has to do with our remote access protocols. And really, I'm going to break this down into two areas. We have our remote access protocols and then our remote control protocols. So just going down the list here, we first of all have RAS, which is just simply the remote access service. Now, the remote access service is something that is used by older Windows Server operating systems. Now, I say older because I'll move us right down a notch here to routing and remote access service, or RRAS, which is what is used by the newer Windows Server operating systems. And these are the services that allow those server operating systems to provide remote access services. Next, we have the Serial Line Internet Protocol, or SLIP. Now, SLIP is considered to be an old, antiquated remote access protocol. It is still possibly used by some older Unix-based systems, but basically I can tell you that SLIP is not very secure. It doesn't have a lot of functionality. It was one of the original remote access protocols that were created when we first had the idea of allowing users the ability to make connections from a remote location. So I just wanted to mention it. It's not even listed on the Network Plus objectives, but I wanted to mention it because I think it's important that you know the history behind where some of this came from. So this was one of the original remote access protocols, not so much used anymore. What we use now would be PPP, or the point-to-point protocol. Okay, and I'll tell you what, the point-to-point protocol has been around for quite some time as well, but it's so well designed that it is still the standard remote access protocol that we use today. And as a matter of fact, I will tell you that our VPN protocols, as a for instance, right, we have the point-to-point tunneling protocol. Well, when we establish a VPN, although we may be using PPTP to secure the data, we're using PPP to actually transmit the data, to actually make the remote access connection. Now, one of the other aspects of the point-to-point protocol is the authentication that it allows for, and it's got a lot of flexibility when it comes to this authentication, and we're going to talk about user authentication in just a moment here. So we'll come back to that. But next on the list here, we have PPPoE, which is the point-to-point protocol over Ethernet. And this is a protocol that's used to allow multiple network users on an Ethernet network to connect to a remote site through a single device, like a DSL or cable modem. And I will tell you that PPPoE is most typically seen, it's most typically used when you have DSL modem connectivity, when you're using a DSL line to gain access to the internet. Now, some of our other remote access protocols, which I'm going to classify as remote control protocols, are the remote desktop protocol, RDP, virtual network computing, VNC, and independent computing architecture, or ICA. Now, all three of these protocols are pretty much the same thing, just used in different places. Okay, so as a for instance, RDP is pretty much specifically used by Windows, okay, or by Microsoft in a Windows environment. ICA was designed by Citrix, okay, so it's their version of remote control. And then we have VNC, which is actually, it's a whole description of the system which makes up the concept of remote control and is used by many different systems. I will make a quick mention that VNC actually is, well, it's more of a system than an actual protocol, and the protocol that it uses is something called RFB, which stands for Remote Frame Buffer. Okay, and so that's the actual protocol that VNC uses. Now, I will tell you that that's a lot more than you really need to know. What I want you to know is the names. RDP, VNC, and ICA. What do? They all allow for remote control. Now, what does that mean? Right? What's the difference between remote access and remote control? Well, when it comes to remote access, we're talking about having a user have a computer that's away from the internal network, but that computer can then access the internal network and access the resources on the internal network. Whereas remote control is where a remote user can, from a remote location, access an individual computer and take control over that computer's resources. So basically, you could be sitting on a client computer at your desk, as a for instance. So it doesn't necessarily have to be remote, like outside of the internal network. In this instance, remote control could even be within your network. So you could be sitting at your own client computer at your desk, and maybe you want to go ahead and manage a server sitting in a cold, not so fun server room. So what you do is you go ahead and via one of these remote control protocols, you connect to that server, and what comes up on your screen is the actual desktop of the server. And as you start moving the mouse, well, you're moving the mouse on the server. As you click to open things, you're opening things on the server. So that's what our remote control protocols are used for. All right, so now let's move along. Now that we've talked about firewalls and protection devices and network access security, let's talk about user authentication. Right? We just mentioned authentication a couple of different times when we were talking about network access. But before we get into the specific authentication protocols, I want to talk to you about this thing called AAA. AAA stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. And although very often they tend to be kind of glommed together into one thought, they are actually three separate processes. Authentication is the process of identifying a user or computer. To authenticate something is to identify what it is. Okay, so authentication, although very often we think of it as, well, have you authenticated that user? We think of the whole process of, not just knowing who the user is, but what they gain access to and all that stuff. Well, the reality is authentication is just identifying that user or that computer. Authorization is then the process of determining the level of access for that user or computer. Okay, the authorization process is the one where we say, all right, well, now that we know who that user is, well, what do they have access to? Or do they have access to this particular resource? Are they authorized to access this resource? So that is what authorization is. Now, accounting is the process of keeping a log of activity by that user or computer. Sometimes accounting is referred to as auditing. Whatever you want to call it, it's a matter of keeping track of where they've been, what they've done, how long they were there, what did they do when they were there, what did they touch, etc., etc. And it's not just a matter of watching users, but again, it could be watching systems as well. So you need to make sure that you understand the breakdown between authentication, authorization, and accounting. Now, there are two protocols that are used to provide all three. And those protocols are called Radius and TACACS. Radius stands for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service, and TACACS stands for Terminal Access Controller Access Control System. Now, both provide a similar level of services in the sense that they handle complete authentication, authorization, and accounting. But one significant difference between them is that TACACS relies on TCP connections, whereas Radius utilizes UDP connections, right? And we know that TCP, we learned this in a previous video, TCP is a connection-oriented, reliable transport layer protocol, and UDP is a connectionless transport protocol. So that's one of the main differences between them. Now, to truly help describe what they do, I have a picture for you. Here's an example of how Radius would work. You have many users out there who may want to, let's say, VPN into your network across the internet. And in order to service all these different clients that are out on the internet, you may have so many of them that a single remote access server is not going to do the job. So as you can see here, they're going to VPN into a pool of remote access servers. Or maybe we have one group of users who are going to connect to one specific remote access server, and another pool who's going to a different remote access server, and another pool that's going to a different remote access server. Well, there's a number of different ways of setting this up, but the bottom line is you have multiple remote access servers, so those remote access servers will be configured as what's called Radius clients. And what that means is those remote access servers aren't going to be able to provide remote access service all by themselves. They will all have to go ahead and get their instructions from a Radius server. So basically, the clients connect to the remote access server, which will act as a Radius client, because it will then pass the request on to a Radius server. Okay, so this is kind of a centralized Radius server, or it's centralized management, we could say, where this Radius server is going to set up the same rules for all remote access servers. But the other thing that the Radius server does is it is then responsible for communicating with the authentication server. And in this case, it's an example of Microsoft world, because the authentication server is listed as an Active Directory domain controller. So the Radius server will query Active Directory to see whether that user is using the appropriate credentials and whether they are allowed to have remote access to the network. The Radius server, when it gets the response back from the Active Directory domain controller, then passes that result back out to the Radius clients, who will then go ahead and tell the end user whether they get in or not. Now, another thing that the Radius server can do is the Radius server, along with just being responsible for centralizing rules and centralizing the authentication requests off to Active Directory, is that a Radius server can also be set up to do accounting and to keep a log of who has remotely connected to the network, or who has accessed the network, when did they access, and for how long did they access. So in that sense, the Radius server is able to go ahead and handle the authentication, the authorization, and the accounting of all remote access to the network. Now, another form of authentication that we can put in place is something called PKI. Now, PKI, the public key infrastructure, is actually a term that is used to describe a network which has been fully configured to use secure protocols to have an overall bigger picture level of authentication and security. It's where we have many different devices which have all been configured to use certificates and public key encryption for the security. So just so as to not be confused between public key infrastructure and public key encryption, we'll talk about public key encryption in just a moment, but the infrastructure itself is the whole bigger concept of setting up an entire infrastructure of security. Now, I mentioned certificates and public key encryption. Certificates are a form of electronic identification cards which can only be issued by authorized issuers. Okay, so now there's a whole lesson that I could give you on certificates, but I will tell you that basically we have things called certification authorities, which can be set up either on an internal network or there are public certification authorities. One of the most well-known public certification authorities is something called VeriSign. You may have seen that name or heard that name out there. And these certification authorities are what's known as trusted parties. And what they are trusted is they are trusted to identify who or what something really is so that they can then issue one of these certificates, and then that person or that computer can then use that certificate as a form of identification. And it's really a lot like when you go get a driver's license or an identification card from your local government, in the sense that there are theoretical trusted entities, right, the local government, who can issue these cards. And therefore, when you use these cards and you present these cards in different places, well, you're allowed to do things as a result. Now, public key encryption is a form of what we call asymmetric encryption. I'm going to explain this in much more detail as we go along here. In order to explain asymmetric encryption, we need to first understand cryptography. Now, cryptography is the process of applying an algorithm to clear text, right, or plain text, in order to convert it into what's called ciphertext, right, in order to encode it. Secret keys are used as a variable in the algorithm to keep the formula secure. Now, these keys can be symmetric or asymmetric, and I'll talk again a little bit about symmetric versus asymmetric in just a moment here, but let me give you an example. If I have the example of an algorithm that says go up X letters, right, that's the formula. An algorithm that says go up a certain number of letters, if we're just talking about like words. In this algorithm, the key is X. Okay, that's our variable. That's the unknown. That's what keeps this formula secure. If X is 2, then the words train signal would become or something like that. In other words, the letter T in train signal, if you go up 2 letters, it becomes the letter V. The letter R becomes T, the letter A becomes C, the letter I becomes K, and the letter N becomes P, etc., etc., etc. So this would be, right here, this would be the ciphertext version of the clear text words train signal. Whereas if that variable, if X was 5, well then you can see that the words train signal become a whole different set of letters. And that's how the key can really change how text gets encrypted. Now, let's talk about the differences between what we mean by symmetric key versus asymmetric key. With symmetric key encryption, the same key is used to encrypt and decrypt the data. In other words, if I wanted to have secure communications with you, you and I would have to both possess the same key. We would both have to know the same key, because it works just like the previous example, in the sense that if I know the key was 2, and I know the algorithm is go up 2 letters, well, then when you decrypt the data, you just reverse the algorithm, and you say you go down 2 letters to turn the ciphertext into plain text. That's decrypting the data. When you use symmetric key encryption, there needs to be a key for every unique communication. In other words, in order for you and I to communicate securely, we have to agree upon a key. Whereas if I want to communicate securely with somebody else, Well, I can't use the same key that I'm using with you, or else that someone else would be able to know about our conversations, and you would be able to know about my conversations with the other person. So I would have to have a key for secure communications between me and that other person. And then if you want to communicate with that other person, there'd have to be a key for that communication. So there's going to be a lot of keys. And therefore, key exchange and storage can really be a challenge. Because for instance, how am I going to get the key to you, right? If I have a key in mind that I want to use, right? I've created some encrypted data and I want to share that data with you. How do I get the key to you? How do we figure out that we're going to agree upon this key securely? Because I mean, if I say to you, hey, the key's going to be that we're going to go up 2 letters. Well, someone might hear that, and now that's got to be secured, or that communication has to be secured. So actually, when you use symmetric key encryption, and I'm kind of skipping here to the last point that I have here, if you're going to communicate that key, right? If I'm going to say to you, hey, the key is go up 2 letters. If I'm going to say that to you and it's going to be in an unsecure environment, well, then we're going to use an asymmetric key encryption to secure that transmission. Now, I know that might sound confusing right now because we haven't talked about asymmetric encryption yet. But I just wanted you to know that that's why key exchange can be a challenge. Now, key storage can be a challenge because of the sheer volume of keys that you can have if you have a lot of users who are all going to be communicating with each other. Matter of fact, just to give you an idea, as of for instance, let's say that there's 3 of us. Well, let's start with just 2 of us. If the 2 of us want to communicate using a symmetric key, well, there just needs to be the 1 key, right? So just 1 key. If there are 3 of us that need to communicate, well, I need to be able to securely communicate with you. I need to securely communicate with the other person. That's 2 keys. And you need to securely communicate with the other person. So that's 3 keys total. No big deal, right? 3 people, 3 keys. How about 4 people? Well, I would need 3 keys to communicate with each of the 3 other people. But then there's still 3 people left. And those 3 people are going to need, as we just learned, 3 more keys. So now we end up going up to a total of 6 keys. And I will tell you that the number starts growing essentially almost in an exponential fashion, where we went from 1 key to 3 keys to 6 keys. And if we were to continue on from there, I'll tell you what, let's say that we went to 10 people. When we get to 10 people, well, the math kind of works out that I need 9 keys to talk to the 9 other people. Then you could go to the next person in line who would need 8 keys to talk to the remaining other 8 people. And then the next person in line would need 7 keys to talk to the remaining 7 people. Plus 6, plus 5, plus 4, plus 3, plus 2, plus 1. And you end up needing 45 keys for 10 people. So the number could get quite large, and that's why storage of these keys, secure storage of these keys, can be a challenge. And therefore, symmetric key encryption is only good for use in a small, secure environment. Now that takes us into asymmetric key encryption. With asymmetric key encryption, we use key pairs for the encryption and decryption of data. In other words, there will always be a pair of keys involved, and 1 key in the pair is used to encrypt the data, and then the other key in the pair is used to decrypt the data. Now, because of this, I will tell you, and for right now, you're going to have to take my word for this, and then I'm going to show you how this works. But key exchange and storage is simplified. We actually also have fewer keys. For every user who's going to participate with asymmetric key encryption, there needs to be a pair of keys for that particular user. So in the instance of having 10 users, well, you end up with, instead of 45 keys, you end up with only 20 keys. In other words, no matter how many users there are, it's always just times 2. So that it's not done exponentially. So you end up with much fewer keys in a large environment. And so it is good for use in a large, unsecure environment, and I'm going to show you why it can be used in an unsecure environment without any real big deal. And it's because the most common form of asymmetric encryption is what's known as public key encryption. Hey, how about that? We kind of came full circle here, didn't we? Right? That's what took us into this whole cryptography and symmetric and asymmetric key encryption, is we were talking about PKI and public key encryption as a part of it. So that's what this is all really about, is public key encryption. With public key encryption, every user has a pair of keys. Okay, I mentioned that a moment ago. Every user is going to have a pair of keys. Now, one key in the pair is accessible only to the individual user. Okay, so if you picture yourself as a user who's going to participate in public key encryption, you have a pair of keys that have been assigned to you. One of them, you are the only one who has access to that key. It's in your pocket. This is called your private key. Kind of makes sense. It's private, available only to you. The other key that has been assigned to you, and any other user who is participating in this, is publicly accessible. So this other key that's been assigned to you, I have access to it. This other person sitting next to me has access to it. This other person across the room has access to it. Person sitting next to you has access to it. Everybody has access to it. And that's why this is referred to as your public key. Okay, so you have a pair of keys assigned to you. One only you have access to. It's your private key. One everybody has access to. It's your public key. I have a pair of keys assigned to me. One is in my pocket and is only available to me, and that's my private key. And one is accessible to everybody, and that is my public key. Okay, so just hold on to that one piece of information, and I'm going to now take it a step further and explain how it works. We have an example. If we have 100 users, then there'd be a total of 200 keys. 100 of the keys would be private and only accessible to the individual user who it was assigned to. And then we would also have 100 keys, which would be public and would be available to all 100 people. Okay, it's accessible to everybody. What this means is that each user would have access to 101 keys, right? I have access to the 100 public keys that are out there, plus my own one private key. Now, if I want to encrypt some data, I will tell you that any key can be used to encrypt the data. So I have 101 keys available to me to encrypt data with. That's encryption. But the decryption of the data, the accessing of the data, can only be decrypted by one key. And that one key will be the matching paired key against the whatever key it was originally encrypted with. So although I might have a lot of choices in what key I use to encrypt the data is only going to be accessible and decrypted by one matching key. Now let me kind of draw this out for you, see if we can make this completely make sense. Because I'm going to bet, unless you've studied this before, you're feeling a little lost right now. And that's okay if you are. It's typical. This is a lot to take in. So for right now, before we even get into the picture I have on the screen right now, here's the basics. Everybody has a pair of keys. You have a pair of keys, and I have a pair of keys. One of those keys is private, accessible only to you, and one of them is public, accessible to everybody. That's all you need to know right now. Okay? Nothing else. Here we have an example of a couple users, John and Mary. John wants to send secure data to Mary. Alright, if John wants to send data securely, then what John is going to do is encrypt the data with Mary's public key. So John is going to take Mary's public key. Does John have access to Mary's public key? Sure he does. Everybody has access to Mary's public key. It'll be stored in a publicly accessible location, and it's available to everybody. So John will take Mary's public key and encrypt the data. So now the data has been turned into ciphertext, and John will then send that secured ciphertext across the network over to Mary. Mary will then decrypt the data using her own private key. Does Mary have access to her private key? Sure she does. It's her private key. It's been assigned to her. Why does she need to decrypt the data with her private key? Well, because it was originally encrypted with her public key. And remember, once the data has been encrypted, there's only one key that can decrypt the data, and that's the matching paired key. So because John encrypted it with Mary's public key, guess what? The data cannot even be decrypted with that same public key. The only key that can decrypt the data is the matching paired key, which is Mary's private key. And who has access to Mary's private key? Only Mary. And that's how we consider that this data was sent securely, is because the only person that had access to be able to decrypt the data was Mary. If anybody else would have intercepted that data along the way, they wouldn't have been able to do anything with it because they don't know how. It's just ciphertext, and they don't know how to decrypt it back into plain text. Now, that's one form of public key encryption. There's another form of encryption, and this is what actually, again, just to come full circle to the topic that we're on right now, because we're not on the topic of securing data. We're on the topic of authentication. So, public key encryption can be used to send authenticated data. So in this case, John wants to send authenticated data to Mary. In other words, he wants to send data to Mary, and he wants her to be able to validate that he was the originator. Authenticate that the data truly came from John, not from somebody else claiming to be John. Well, here's how it works. John is going to take the data and encrypt it with his own private key. Okay, so John reaches in his pocket, takes his own private key, which only he has access to, and encrypts the data. John now takes this authenticated data, okay, it's actually encrypted data, and sends it over to Mary. But here's the thing. It's not really, we say it's authenticated, not really encrypted, and the reason why is because if somebody else were to intercept the data, well, it was originally encrypted with John's private key, which means what key is going to be used to decrypt the data? That's right. It's decrypted using John's public key. And who has access to John's public key? Everybody. Because it's available to the public. It's the public key. So it's not being sent securely in this case. But here's the deal. Since Mary had to go get John's public key to decrypt the data, since that's the only key that was able to decrypt the data, she knows that it must have been originally encrypted with John's private key. And who has access to John's private key? Only John. Therefore, she is able to authenticate that this data truly came from John and was not tampered with along the way. And that's how this comes full circle and relates to user authentication, is that authentication can be done through public key encryption as part of a PKI, a public key infrastructure. Now, coming back to that topic of user authentication, we have something called 802.1x, which is considered to be a secure network access control standard. It's not really a protocol as much as a standard. It's really a set of protocols and requirements, and what's included in with it is the use of certificates, okay, and certificate services, and radius. Okay, so it's really a sophisticated level of security that you put in place to truly authenticate users before they can access a network. Now, it is typically used to secure wireless network access, but I will tell you that 802.1x was not designed explicitly for wireless access. It is fully capable of securing wired networks as well. Kerberos is another form of authentication. It's actually an authentication protocol. Kerberos uses a secret key to keep authentication information, things like usernames and passwords, secure, and that's why we call it a secure authentication protocol. Kerberos uses symmetric key encryption. That's why we needed to talk about that before. It uses symmetric key encryption, so it typically would be used within private networks where key management can be handled easily. An example of where Kerberos is used is by all Windows-based operating systems since Windows 2000. Okay, so all of your Active Directory-based networks all use Kerberos to allow users to log into the network. And along those same lines, Kerberos allows for users to have what's called single sign-on. That means that a user can authenticate once, and they are granted a ticket or token. Both terms are interchangeable. They're given an access token or a ticket to go ahead and present as they roam around the network to access various resources without having to re-authenticate, without having to re-enter credentials. Users can just log on once and then start accessing stuff. Now, Kerberos can also be used for what's called mutual authentication, and that is where the client and the server both authenticate who they are or what they are to each other. Very often we think of authentication as being a client authenticating or verifying who it is to a server, providing credentials to a server. Well, mutual authentication is where a client can also make the server validate who it is to make sure that it's truly communicating with the server that it believes it's communicating with. But that's kind of a side note that kind of goes outside the realm of where we're at right now. Just kind of a side note, something I wanted you to know about Kerberos. Now, I mentioned a little while ago when we were talking about the point-to-point protocol, how there are a number of remote access authentication protocols that are supported. And I have a number of them listed here. First, we have PAP, the Password Authentication Protocol. And I will tell you that this is, for all intents and purposes, never used. This is something that was used way back in the initial days of remote access connectivity. And it was just the general idea of, hey, can we find a way to allow users to authenticate while accessing a network remotely? It's just the concept of presenting usernames and passwords. But the problem is that those usernames and passwords are presented in plain text. And because they are sent in plain or clear text, they can be easily captured. So that's why we don't use this anymore. Now, the Challenge Handshake Allocation Protocol, or CHAP, was the first what was considered to be secure remote access authentication protocol, because CHAP allows you to authenticate without having to send the actual username and password across the network in clear text, unsecure fashion. So CHAP is considered to be the first secure way of authenticating to a remote access server. Although I will tell you that it's considered in Microsoft land as only a middle level of security. If you want to go to a high level of security, well, then you have to use the Microsoft version, the Microsoft Challenge Handshake Allocation Protocol, which not only do they have MS-CHAP, but they even created MS-CHAP version 2, which is even more secure. Now, the main difference that I want you to know between MS-CHAP and MS-CHAP v2 is basically MS-CHAP is used with older Microsoft operating system like Windows 95 and Windows NT, and MS-CHAP v2 is used with the more modern versions of Microsoft's operating systems. Okay, things like Windows XP and Vista. The other main thing that I want you to remember is, let's just go with the high-level bullet point here. PAP, unsecure, just completely unsecure, clear text. CHAP, secure and supported by all platforms. Okay, so if you're using multiple platforms for remote access, you have different clients from different operating vendors, or operating system vendors, I should say, then you could use CHAP. And if you're going to go strictly with Microsoft and you want to have a higher level of security, then you're going to go with MS-CHAP or MS-CHAP v2. And the only difference is depending on how new or old the Microsoft operating system is. Now, there is one other form of remote access authentication protocol, and that is the Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP. The Extensible Authentication Protocol is one that allows us to go ahead and use multi-factor authentication via remote access. Now, what do I mean by multi-factor authentication? Well, one way that we can secure or help secure authentication to a system is by implementing more than one factor of authentication. Now, here's what I mean. There are basically three factors of authentication that we can have. And those factors are called what you know, what you have, and who you are. Those are the three different factors. Now, typically, we think everything we've talked about so far has to do with what you know, right? In other words, if you know the username and password and you enter it, boom, you're in. That's single factor authentication. It's just what you know. What you have would be, an example would be if we had smart cards. Smart cards are a little card that a user would carry around with them, and then you'd have a smart card reader at the machine, and in order to log in, you would have to put your card in and enter the password. So now we have multi-factor, right? It's what you have. You physically have to have the card, and you have to know something. You have to know the password. Now, the other factor is who you are. And an example of that would be when we use biometrics. So maybe we have fingerprint scanning set up on a system. And the only way for a user to gain access to the system is to go ahead and have a matching fingerprint, which of course is unique to every individual. So that's how it's who you are. So the Extensible Authentication Protocol is one that allows us to use things like smart cards and biometrics via remote access. Now, just to make sure that you don't get this confused, you don't need the Extensible Authentication Protocol to do multi-factor authentication locally. Something like Kerberos can be used if you're going to do multi-factor authentication locally on a machine. The Extensible Authentication Protocol is specifically used for multi-factor authentication via remote access. All right, now moving along into device security. It's very important to keep your network devices secure. Now, when we talk about network devices, talking about things like servers that provide networking services, routers, switches, hubs, wireless access points, etc., etc. Now, these devices should be secured from local access as well as remote access. So we need to keep these devices secure in two different fashions. When I say local access, I'm saying secure it using physical security. Okay, you actually have to physically secure these devices. With regards to remote access, we're talking about securing through secure connectivity protocols, some of which we've already been talking about in this video. Now, let's go back to physical security for just a moment, because one of the most overlooked areas of security is the restriction of physical access to these important network devices like servers, switches, and routers. Okay, I'm telling you, It's one of the most overlooked things out there. Maybe not so much the servers. Servers very often do get locked away in a server room or a server closet, but not always. I've walked into many companies, especially smaller companies, where the server just sits under someone's desk. Matter of fact, I've walked into a company where the server, the main server, this was a small company that had one server that was like doing everything for the company, and it had databases and all kinds of confidential information. It was kept not only under someone's desk, but that someone was the receptionist in the lobby. And when I first went to this company, and I went there as a computer consultant, when I went to this company, I walked in the door and they didn't even have a receptionist working there. She was on vacation. So the desk was just kind of sitting there. I actually had to walk into the company to go find somebody to let them know I was there. Oh my goodness. I couldn't believe that when I got to the people and said, all right, I'm here to help you out with your networking needs. And they said, all right, we're having a problem with our server. And I said, okay, where's the server? I couldn't believe they took me back out to the receptionist desk. It's unbelievable. So it is overlooked. It's not thought of. And I'll tell you what, you need to lock that stuff down. If somebody can gain physical access to a device, then all the logical security in the world is meaningless, because it can all be surpassed once you gain physical access. So we can remedy this situation by locking these devices in a secure room. And if a secure room is not available, okay, if there are devices that cannot be placed in a secure location because of the proximity maybe of where they need to be relative to the services they're providing, well then it's a good idea to implement, well there's two things I'll tell you. One would be to implement surveillance equipment. Okay, put surveillance equipment out there so that you can at least keep an eye on what's happening with that device. And I will tell you that when it comes to surveillance equipment, I have two suggestions. Well, it's really one suggestion, but two forms of surveillance. I suggest that you put surveillance equipment, cameras, where they can be seen. In other words, put cameras right out in the open where they can be seen so that it acts as a deterrence to would-be attackers. Okay? Actually have it so that an attacker can go, ooh, I don't know that I want to go mess with that device. There's a camera staring at me. But along those same lines, the problem with having a camera out in the open is that somebody might, because they know that the camera's there, and they really want to get in, well, they might attack that camera first. So I recommend that you also put a secondary camera in a hidden location where they don't know where it is. Okay? And I will tell you, this might sound like, oh my goodness, I'm not going to go ahead and set up a dual surveillance system for all my networking devices that are out there. That's just ridiculous. I'd go broke just setting up surveillance. I agree with that. You need to evaluate how secure any particular device needs to be. When I say implement this dual layer of surveillance, I'm talking about for your really high-end security needs. Now, the other thing that I was going to mention that you can do if a device can't be put in a secure location is at least maybe put it in a hidden location. In other words, if it can't be in a locked room, well, maybe you can put it up above a false ceiling or below a raised floor. Or sometimes you might even just put it, instead of just having it sitting on a desk where everybody sees it, maybe as long as there's not going to be, let's say either cabling issues or interference issues, maybe it's put in a desk drawer or under the desk. Things like that. At least try to have it hidden. Which, by the way, if I go back to that story of that server and I mentioned the receptionist desk, now that I think about it, it wasn't under the receptionist desk. It was actually on the receptionist desk. And not sitting on there as in like on there waiting to be serviced. That's where it permanently was. That's where its location was. It was on the desk where you could see it. So I actually forgot about that until just now when I mentioned putting it under the desk. So you really want to make sure that you avoid doing that. Now, as far as remote security goes, basically you just want to keep in mind that some communication protocols send data in clear text, plain text, in an unsecure fashion, and other protocols send data in a secure fashion. And so here I have a table which lists all the unsecure protocols like FTP, HTTP, Telnet, RSH, RCP, and SNMP if you're using version 1 or 2. And then their secure equivalent, which is a protocol that would have similar functionality but would do things in a more secure or encrypted fashion. So you're going to probably want to know these particular protocols because they are listed as part of the objectives for the Network Plus exam, but on a higher level, keep in mind that these are not the only protocols involved with remote communication. What I want you to keep in mind is the general concept that you always want to look at any protocol that's going to be transmitting data to a network device or from a network device and think about whether you want to have that communication done securely so as to help protect that device. Now, the last topic that I want to talk to you about here, and then we'll wrap up this video, are some of your common security threats. Okay, just general ideas of things that you want to keep in mind, things that are out there that can present a security threat to your network, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you can mitigate against these threats. Now, the first thing I have here are viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. Viruses are software which are designed to perform harm to a system, and they are loaded without the user's permission and in some cases without the user's knowledge. Okay, so the idea behind a virus is it's something that gets into the system and it's designed to cause harm to that system. So it's bad. They're programs basically, and they're bad. They're bad programs. Now, worms are a form of virus. They are a form of virus which can self-propagate from system to system. And the other thing about a worm that's different from just a standard virus is that a worm does not require a host application. See, a virus usually attaches itself to some other program, whereas a worm does not require any other program. It's self-contained and it knows how to go ahead and propagate from one system to another and can be some of the most dangerous viruses out there. I mean, some of the really big ones that you hear about are worms because they get released and then boom, they propagate everywhere. Now, a Trojan horse is a form of virus which disguises itself as a harmless program. And it does this to fool the user into installing it and or executing it so that it can then perform the harm that it was designed to do in the first place. And when I say harm, by the way, harm can be actually destroying a system, or it could be even just stealing information off a system or granting access to somebody that's not supposed to have access to a system. So a Trojan horse is one that disguises itself as one thing, and then when it is launched by the user, it then does something else. Now, another type of attack that's out there, another threat that you have working against you, is something called denial of service. And sometimes you'll see this presented as distributed denial of service, or DDoS. And the only real difference between denial of service and distributed denial of service is whether the attack is coming from a single system or many systems at once. Now, a denial of service is an attack which is not designed to specifically steal or destroy any of your systems or your network, but rather to overwhelm a system to the point that it cannot perform its regularly designed functions. It's basically a form of attack which is designed to just take a system down. So you see these types of attacks on certain systems like, let's say, web servers. You may have a web server that you use to provide services to your clients. And especially if you're an e-commerce company where you are providing your main services via the web server, well, an attacker can hurt you pretty severely by just simply taking down your web server. And one of the ways that this is done, if you can't break into the server so as to destroy it or take it down, well, then another way is to pound that server with so much information, keep it so busy that it has no time to provide its regularly scheduled services. So I have listed also here something called a Smurf, or a Smurf attack. Now, I picked this particular one because it is also listed on the Network Plus objectives, but there are a number of different denial of service attacks out there. A Smurf is a denial of service attack where a ping request is sent out to a broadcast address with the source address being spoofed as the IP address of the computer, or we'll say the server, or even we'll just say network device that you're looking to take down. Because if we go back to remembering what ping does, basically when you send a ping from one system to another, you're sending an echo request saying, please reply to me if you're getting this. And you can even modify those ping requests to make them larger. And you can also modify them to make it so that there are multiple and sometimes even continuous replies. And if this ping request was sent to the broadcast address, that means that every single computer on the network segment is going to see this request, acknowledge the request, and respond to this request. So you now have every single computer all simultaneously and sometimes continuously sending these echo responses to what they believe to be the original sender. And then that original sender is so busy acknowledging those ping responses that it doesn't have time to do anything else. So that's Smurf attack. Now, some other forms of security threats that are out there is something called social engineering, or what's sometimes referred to also as phishing, but I will explain the difference. Social engineering is where someone is pretending to be somebody else in order to gain your trust so you will share secret information. Social engineering is done a lot with humans on the phone, where you call and you pretend to be somebody that you're not, or you pretend to know something that you don't really know in order to fool somebody into telling you information that they're not supposed to tell you. And thus the name social engineering. You are using social measures. You're using human kindness. You're socially trying to get them to think that you are somebody who is trustworthy, so they'll give you information. Now, the phishing aspect of this, and phishing, as you can see, is spelled with a PH, not with an F. Okay, so right here, it's not like we're going out to catch fish. No. We're going to catch suckers. Phishing is where you typically via email kind of spoof yourself or make yourself look to be sending this email from somebody other than who you really are, so as to convince the user to go ahead and give you private information. Sometimes these emails are used to send you to a phony website, which will then prompt you to enter private information, which is not actually going to the website that they think it's going to the attacker. I will give you a very, very common example of this. I myself have received phishing emails which were designed to make me believe that my PayPal account had been compromised. I received an email that had the PayPal logo on it. It sure seemed to look like it came from a PayPal email address, and it said that my PayPal account had been compromised, it had been temporarily suspended, and that I could have it released by going to the PayPal security website and verifying my information. And there was a link conveniently provided in this email, which then allowed me to go to a website, right? The theoretical secure PayPal
or PayPal security website and verify my information like my name and address and bank account number, maybe my social security number, etc., etc. Well, the reality is that that link, although the words in the link might have said it was going to the PayPal security website, it was actually taking me to another website, which was owned by who knows who. And that website, by the way, also had the PayPal logo on it, and it looked just like PayPal's security website to make you believe that it really was them. Now, I just feel fortunate that I work in technology and I understand these types of attacks because I did not fall victim to it. I ended up reporting this particular email and website and had them shut down within 24 hours. But I can only imagine how many people fell victim to this before I got them. And I won't take the full credit. I'm sure I'm one of many people who probably were aware of this and got them shut down. But I'm pretty persistent when I come across this. This stuff really kind of ticks me off. So I stay real vigilant with it and stick with it until it's shut down. And that's why, like I said, I'm probably not the only one, but I definitely stuck with it, and it was shut down within 24 hours. And it scares me to death that some of my other family members could easily fall victim to this if they don't understand about these social engineering or phishing related emails and websites. Now, another type of security threat or another type of attack is something called the man-in-the-middle attack. And it is just what it sounds like. An attacker would get in the middle. They would they find a way to get themselves on the network in between a sender and a recipient. And what they do is they intercept information while it's being transmitted, modify that transmission, and then pass it along. And the reason they modify it is because they're trying to manipulate the conversation so as to get the two parties involved to reveal extra information that they can then intercept and use to their advantage. Now, sometimes a man in the middle will only intercept the information just for the point of gathering the information and stealing the information. But very often, a true man in the middle attack will be somebody who will then alter the transmission so that the people involved think that the person they're communicating with is making different requests than what they're really making, and then they divulge information that they otherwise would not send in that transmission. Another form of security threat is something called rogue access points. And rogue access points are really quite simply access points that are placed on your network without administrators' knowledge. Thus the name rogue. Basically, the problem is if you have somebody on the network who has knowledge of how things work, and maybe even they have certain privileges on the network, they go out there and just go get some cheap wireless access point, and then they put it on the network because, maybe they got a laptop and they think, this is going to be easy for me to go ahead and connect my laptop to the network now because I got a wireless access point. But the problem is that that wireless access point doesn't have the security implemented that you have designed for the rest of your network. So that's where this can definitely be a security threat. All right, one other really big issue that you need to keep in mind when it comes to security threats. Who are your attackers? Who do you think? Who would attack your network? Is it going to be people trying to steal your company secrets? Could be. Is it going to be somebody who's trying to take down your network? Could be. What if we said, where are your attackers? Are they people coming from the internet? Are they people inside your own network? Who are the attackers? Who do you need to protect against? Well, there's a real easy answer to this. Everyone is a potential attacker. And that's why security is so important. See, a lot of people think that security is not a big deal on certain networks. They say, no big deal. Who'd want to steal my stuff? Well, here's the thing. Here's a couple issues. One, Just because you don't have anything to steal doesn't mean that you're not going to have someone out there who's just bored. There are plenty of smart people out there who are just bored. And so they go ahead and they scan the internet looking for people who aren't secure. And then they mess with you. Why? Because they can and they're bored. But another form of attacker that a lot of people don't think about are your internal attackers. And I'm not talking about somebody who sneaks into your company. I'm not talking about a spy that your competition has convinced to go take a job with your company to find things out. No, I'm not talking about that. I mean, sure, that is an issue. I'm talking about good, honest people who accidentally come across something they're not supposed to come across. And it's just too enticing for them to walk away. An analogy I could give you would be, well, you think you're an honest person? I'm hoping you're saying yes. Let's say you're an honest person. You're walking down the street. On the street in front of you, you see a $100 bill. You know it's not yours. Are you going to pick it up? Probably. Are you going to turn it in? Are you going to go to the police department and say, hey, I found this $100 bill on the street and it's not mine? Doubtful. It's just too enticing. It's free money. It's $100. So, network security also has to do with even keeping the honest people honest. I can tell you an example of a company that I worked for, and I had no intentions of doing anything wrong. I liked working for that company. I liked the company and had no issues. Well, one day, actually it was one evening, I was there and I was looking for something out on the network, and that something was something legitimate to do my job. But what ended up happening was, by complete accident, I came across a file, and this file, I don't remember all the details because it's a good many years ago, but this file had a name that I can't remember if it was just intriguing enough of a name or if it was similar of a name to what I was looking for, that I opened up the file. I opened up the document. And the document ended up being one that showed, you're going to love this, every single person in my department, and it had their evaluations, their annual evaluations. And along with those evaluations included every single one of their salaries. Now, did I mean to come across this information? Did I even care to come across this information? No. But once it was in front of me, do you think I closed it really fast and shut my eyes and said, oh, no, I'm not supposed to see that? No, of course not. I'm curious. I looked. Now, could I have possibly used that information to my advantage? Sure, I could have. Did I? No. And I'm not even going to say no because I'm that honest a person. I actually wasn't with that company much longer. And no, I didn't get fired for finding that document. It just worked out that I moved along in my career. So I wasn't there very long, but I could have. So it's just the idea of keeping honest people honest and keeping them out of areas that they're not supposed to be. Everybody is a potential attacker. Now, what can we do to help protect our network? I mean, we just learned there's a whole lot of danger out there, right? What can we do to protect our network? Well, one thing we can do is implement strong policies and procedures with regards to security. In the documentation video, I talked about policy and procedure documentation, but we didn't really talk about it from a security point of view. But yes, policies and procedures include security. How are we going to secure things? Why are we going to secure things? Heck, we have to have documented what we're going to secure. And then we need to also have, well, what do we do when there is an intrusion? How do we handle that? What is the procedure? Having these strong policies and procedures in place will give everybody guidance on exactly how to keep the network secure and what to do in the event that there's an intrusion. You can also conduct well thought out and continuous end user training. Now, you want to be careful with this one, because first of all, this one is crucial. End user training is one of the most important things you can do to help protect your network. The number one vulnerability that any network administrator has on their network is the end user. End users can fall victim to social engineering and phishing so easily. Users can invite Trojan horses into a network without ever really thinking twice, because they'll think it's some fun game they want to play or some cool picture they want to look at. Users are the biggest security vulnerability to a network. For that reason, end user training is one of the most important things. But it is very important to make sure that it is well thought out training. And here's why. Being a trainer, I can tell you that I have taught many a class where the users were forced to be there and the material had very little to do with anything that they cared about or things that pertained to them. And for that reason, I really never had their attention. And although there might have been a small percentage of that training that was vital, which could have helped protect the network, the users didn't grasp it because they had shut off their brains because they just didn't care to be there. So you want to make sure that it's appropriate training for those users and continuous, in the sense that just because you train somebody once doesn't mean that they now fully understand how to help protect your network forever. Okay? Security changes. So you need to have regular training of your users. Another thing that we can do is keep all of our security related patches and updates up to date. Heck, automate it as much as you can if possible. And when I say security related patches and updates, I'm not just talking about Windows Update. I'm not just talking about keeping the operating systems up to date. Keep your applications up to date as well. Keep everything up to date when it comes to security patches. Have a system in place that gets those patches tested and out to your systems as soon as possible at all times. And the last thing that I will mention here is that you should subscribe to security bulletins. There are many, many security bulletins out there that you can subscribe to. These are bulletins which make you aware of newly created and or found security holes. Now, why should you subscribe to these security bulletins? I mean, a lot of administrators are like, oh, heck, I don't have time to read all that. It's like junk mail when it comes in. No, not really. The reason you want to subscribe to them is, guess who's also subscribing to them? That's right, the attackers. The bad people of the world subscribe to the security bulletins. They basically subscribe to these security bulletins, and we'll say Microsoft, as for instance, will send out a security bulletin that says, we just found this gaping hole in our Windows Server 2008 operating system. And you got an attacker out there who's basically reading that saying, thank you. And you know why they're saying thank you? Because the bulletin goes on to say, not only have we found a hole, but here's what it is, here's how you exploit it, etc., etc. So you should also subscribe to these security bulletins so that you can see that there's a problem and then proactively watch to make sure, well, really proactively mitigate, which includes watching, but also possibly making configuration changes to protect against that vulnerability. All right, well, I told you at the beginning of this video that there's a lot when it comes to security. And I also told you that this video was just a high-level overview. Can you believe that? Everything I've shared with you in this video, in this long video, but it may be a video you're going to have to go back and watch again. Well, this video was just a high-level overview. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more when it comes to security. To be a successful network administrator, you need to understand these high-level concepts. If you want to take it to a new level and want to be a security engineer, well, then you're going to need to go out there and learn a whole heck of a lot more. But at this point, you should be able to describe the purpose and also the different types of firewalls and other security related devices that we can use, like IDSs and IPSs. You should be able to explain the different options available to secure access to your network. You should also be able to explain the different forms of authentication that can be used when providing access to your network. And you should be able to describe some of the common security threats that are out there and know how to mitigate against them. All right, well, I think that that's probably enough. I think I've hurt you enough in this video, so I'm going to bring this thing to an end right here. And the only thing that I'll reiterate is if you didn't grasp everything in one shot, go back and watch the video again.